Hi, welcome to week 4 of Introduction to Nonprofit and Ministry Management. This week we're going to be focused on the Create Quadrant, which is really focused on innovation and entrepreneurial skills. This is my favorite quadrant. It's my dominant quadrant and the one that I most enjoy. So if you are in a division of an organization that is focused on new product or program development or business development or possibly social enterprise, then and you did a organizational assessment of competing values framework with the OCAI tool, it's likely that your division would look like this. So if you're, in a internet organization or a tech organization and your job is to come up with new quadrant or new products, then it's probably going to look like this. Not as many nonprofits have these divisions, which says something about a lot of nonprofits. So, anyway, the focus of this week is going to be on this entrepreneurial mindset. And the courses that would cover is our social entrepreneurship course and our small business management course. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the differences between those. So now, if you are focused on the Create Quadrant, the type of performance outcomes that you're going to be considering are things like the number of new products or services launched, the number of new sources of revenue, return on investment of innovation, and revenues derived from new products or services, measures of brand recognition, total growth in sales. So, you think about a lot of tech companies. There's some organizations that they stop coming out with innovative products. And then there's others that, more recently, like Amazon's been leading. They're coming out with, something very interesting and new, all the time. And ultimately their measures, they're going to have to assess the measures for that. So with a nonprofit organization, this might be new programs that you do. And you're going to have two types of measures on this. One is going to be, usually nonprofits do what's called the dual bottom line. So you would say, okay, how is this impacting clients? Is it being transformative for clients? But also, does it have a revenue stream that it attracts that will make it self-sustaining? So that's, one example. And then there's also social entrepreneurship that you might do, or social enterprise. So you might have a coffee house, or you might have a thrift store, or other things. And you're going to be looking at, how are you innovating in that? Now, a thrift store is actually a good example. Most thrift stores actually operate down in the control quadrant because they're a very stable business. But say your thrift store wants to do a lot of selling online and you start to do a lot of innovation in that, then that would be more in the Create Quadrant. So there's a question of how do you improve the organization, and on the Create Quadrant, you're looking for new opportunities. So this is the person who's scanning the horizon, says, wow, there's this, whenever the internet first came out, if you had a thrift store, this would be someone who identified that, hey, we should be selling books online, or, other things along those lines. And looking at a lot of stakeholder analysis, talking with a lot of people, creating strategic vision, and trying to think about how do you communicate that vision, and monitoring market feedback. So those are all ways, I spend a lot of my time talking to partners, talking to students, talking to, other external stakeholders to try to assess, okay, how is the world changing and how can we be nimble to adapt to that? Then there's a question is, how do you communicate and lead for growth? So Steve Jobs from Apple was always the great example of this. You create a picture of a desired future with word pictures and superlatives. Whenever Steve Jobs talked about Apple products, he would always say how amazing it's going to change the world it was. And you try to arouse positive emotions. So you maintain a positive, lighthearted, energetic, and passionate climate in the organization to infuse energy into others. So if you're going to have a bunch of people who are creative, then you're going to have essentially a creative culture to do that. And a lot of the creative organizations that I've seen, I've visited, some of their facilities, and they kind of look crazy, almost like they're playgrounds, because they want to keep that creative culture to what they're doing. So, as I mentioned before, there's tensions between the operations staff, which create rules, and the entrepreneurial staff that, in many ways, they view their role as to break rules and to break the norm. And there's often a tension between those, and you need to create balance. So, an early stage startup is going to look like this. They're going to be very dominant on the create, because ultimately, if you don't create a new idea that succeeds, then you're not going to, do well. But ultimately, as you grow, you need to balance out the various quadrants. And part of what's worth saying is, what your profile should look like will depend on the industry. If you're in the tech industry, you need to have very strong create. But if you're in a very stable manufacturing industry, then you might need more in the control. So what does it look like if you get imbalanced and you have too much on the create? So these are the organizations, you probably heard the phrase program of the week. They start a new program, every week. They're renaming their programs all the time. And the leadership puts all their energy behind the new programs. It might also be that you have vision that sounds great, but never gets realized. Or, an organization that's always changing based on new data, but sometimes those changes are ungrounded. So, ultimately that can become a tumultuous anarchy. I have a strong value for some, charismatic traditions, and have been a part of charismatic churches, in Pentecostal churches, and often, there's a joke among Pentecostals that, we go where the Spirit leads, and it's amazing how much the Spirit changes its mind, because they say that God told me this, but then 2 weeks later, God told me something completely the opposite, right? So, and that's the strength of the creative, but also you have to have policies and controls and organizations, other people that balance you out. And one of the challenges I've seen in organizations is probably the biggest challenge I've seen. As I mentioned, I've worked with several hundred nonprofit organizations. Probably the most significant challenge I've seen is around this imbalance, where organizations, they're changing too much. They're too strong in the create and collaborative, and they can't get enough people in the control quadrant. And because they can't get enough people in the control quadrant, like, they'll hire someone from the control quadrant and they'll quit because it's too chaotic. And ultimately, part of what you need to do is you need to balance the chaos and quit changing things so much, so that the people in the control quadrant, are more comfortable, and to have policies and actually follow those. And learn how to create an environment so that people in the control quadrant can thrive, and not that they, feel that things are too chaotic. And part of the challenge of this, if you're working in at-risk communities, is at-risk communities and under-resourced communities, they're always changing. The environment is chaotic, so that, if you want to be culturally matched, often you have to be strong in both the collaborate and create quadrant. But in doing that limits people in the control quadrant. So that's something to think about if you are like me and you're strong in the create quadrant. So, I already talked about this before. There's a balance between the leader getting too much outside input and having too little input, and you want to be balanced in the middle. There's a balance between being too idealistic and not paying attention to details, and being so focused on the details that you miss the big picture. And the last part of what I want to talk about is some of the key tools we cover in city vision in our courses, and there's basically two schools of thought on innovation. Now, there's a difference between what's called lean startup approach, and that's what we cover in our social entrepreneurship course, and what we cover in our small business management course. And let me talk about that. Small business management does a business plan. A business plan is great if you are going into a fairly well-defined model. So if you're starting up another thrift store, or you are, starting up some sort of catering business for your nonprofit. But often lean startup might be if you're doing a catering business and you're having online orders, and it's, there's much more unknowns. So the idea behind lean startup is that for innovative organizations, the effectiveness of the organization is really around the center thing. It's basically, how do you maximize learning? So you're trying to maximize your loop iteration speed. So they have a term that's called the minimum viable product. And the idea is that you want to come up with something just to test it on the market, the minimum viable product to test it on the market. Often, you'll have .com companies that will say, we want to build this product, say it's a super fancy watch that can control your car or something like that. They'll just put out a website, and then they'll ask, put in your email address if you're interested in this product at this price point. They're not selling it. They're not saying, give us money at this point. And then they're just seeing if people would express interest. Or there's other groups out there, Kickstarter's another one, where people will just put the concept out there to see if people would be willing to fund it. So then you build it, you measure it, and then you learn and you iterate on that. So let me talk about an example of this. So we did this recently with the COVID crisis. So the first step was we were reflecting on the intersection of our core competencies as an organization and our mission with serving in the COVID-19 crisis. So we started with the learning. Then the first thing we did is we created a COVID-19 toolkit Google Doc. And then we did a webinar slide deck as our minimum viable product. And we wanted to test that. So then we sent the toolkit doc to several partners, and we did a webinar proposal. We got feedback from the partners. We got feedback from the webinar. We listened to other webinars. Then we decided to build a website called a free online course called Nonprofit COVID-19. We started to send out other webinars, sent out a mass email trying to get additional feedback from partners. And, initially we had several thousand people sign up for the course, but after, a few months, COVID-19 fatigue started to happen, and there's a flood of similar information that made further investment unwise. Now, you could think, well, that was just a bad idea, but that's not how Lean Startup works. Lean Startup is you continue to, this thing called a pivot. So, we built this free online course, and we realized actually, the nonprofit COVID isn't the interesting thing. What's interesting is offering free courses. So we decided to launch something called the City Vision Institute, where we would provide free courses. And then we contacted key stakeholders on a minimum viable product website for that. And then, right now we're trying to decide, what to do next. And we're going to continue to iterate on that. So that's the idea behind the Lean Startup. There's another tool that's often used in this space called the Business Model Canvas. What the Business Model Canvas is, you could almost think of it as an abbreviated version of a business plan. But what's different about it compared to a business plan works well in a business where you might have a 5% change or 10% change or even a 20% change. But a business model canvas really is designed for having radical changes. So, this pivot that we made from moving from just one course, nonprofitcovid19.org, to the City Vision Institute, I would say that's not a 10% change. That's more like a 500% change to the business plan. And ultimately, that's a lot of, what this is about. And I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but it's basically all the key things you'd put in a business plan onto one page in summary format. But what makes it interesting is it's easy to change. It's easy to adapt. And normally this is used, and the whole lean startup movement came out of Silicon Valley, where there's rapid iteration. But these tools have been adapted to the nonprofit sector. And for the nonprofit sector, part of what you have to realize is that you have essentially two groups you're always serving. You're serving donors and you're serving your clients. And then if you're using this to launch for business models for a new program or product, then you would have a third category. So what I would recommend you do, if you wanted to use this for your organization, you create, your donor category, your client category, and then you create a category for your new program. And you'd have customer segments, customer relationships, channels, value propositions, key activities, key resources, key partners, cost structure, and revenue streams and social outcomes is the summary. So an example of how I did this for COVID-19, we looked at who are going to be our customers, webinar participants, course participants, partner organizations, and what are the value propositions. And then we looked at how can we promote this, and we had various channels that we used to promote that. Then what are the different ways that we're going to interact with the clients and customers. So we had webinar participants, course participants, and partner organizations. We looked at what would be revenue streams, and part of the feedback was we weren't able to get grants to sustain, more on this. And, but the social outcomes, can be measured in terms of number of students. We had key activities, key resources, key partners that we were seeking, and then we the cost structure was fairly minimal. So if you're interested in learning more about that, we have these links, and you can find more information about that. So thanks a lot, and I look forward to sharing with you again next week. Thanks.